This week, we take a look at death. What are some of the oldest death rituals we have in the archaeological record? What happens when you die and you don't follow a particular religion? We're all familiar with what funerals look like in the Western world, but what do they look like everywhere else? And finally, what is a Masonic funeral service and why do we have them? All this and a little bit more in this reflective episode of the Whence Came You podcast. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Whence Came You, a Masonic podcast featuring research papers and discussions related to Freemasonry. Here's your host, Brother Robert Johnson.
Welcome back. This is episode number 503. Straight away, I want to go ahead and give our thanks to our producers, fellows, contributors, and our legacy partners who continue to donate month after month to allow Masonic education to reach the masses the world over. I also want to thank those out there who are sharing the program with their friends, their brothers, and anybody interested in Freemasonry and its quote-unquote kindred sciences. I also want to thank those people out there who give one-time contributions to the show as well. If you want to know more about how you can help support listener-supported Masonic education, head on over to our website, wcypodcast.com, click on Support the Show, and see how you can help. Some other additional ways that you can help are, of course, the same website, but click on the shop. There you'll find the producer's pin. You can pick up any number of books that either I've written or put together with other people, such as Max Heindel's Ancient and Modern Initiation, the special edition, which contains some great new information in there as well to help you understand the man who wrote such an interesting text. You can pick up The Master's Word, one of my favorite books, which is a short treatise on the Word, the Light, and the Self. It is completely annotated and put together by myself and Brother John Ruark. And of course, if you are somebody out there looking to start a new lodge, now I know that sounds like an incredible task to do, but it's really not so hard. And if you want to know how to do that, how to put together something and be really special, something that you can go out and say, we chartered this lodge, this new vision of how you want to have your Freemasonry, then pick up How to Charter a Lodge, a no-nonsense, unsanctioned guide that comes with some great insights from some learned brothers and sisters at large. And of course, that classic book, It's Business Time, Adapting a Corporate Path for Freemasonry, that I co-wrote with Brother John Ruark and is time-tested and brother approved. We've had countless Grand Lodges buy multiple copies to hand out to their Grand Officers. So I hope if you're interested, check it out. It's all there, wcypodcast.com. Click on the shop, and all that money helps support this show too. You get something cool, you help out the show, everybody gets Masonic education. So again, thanks for considering it. Presentations coming up. Well, on the 12th of this month, which will be just in a couple days, you'll be hearing a presentation called The Masonic Pub Crawl, Freemasonry in America and its Colonial Tavern Beginnings. I'm doing that for Olive Branch Lodge number 114 in Virginia, I believe. So we'll see. It'll be at 8 p.m. Eastern is the start time, I think. And once I get Zoom details, we'll go ahead and share those out if I'm allowed. We'll find out from Brother Kevin Homan. All right, now that this is out of the way, this week's topic is difficult to tackle, but I think if we approach it in a special kind of way, we can really think about this maybe a little bit different. Of course, there is this quote from the second movie, National Treasure, where he calls it the debt that all men pay, death. What does this entail? Well, the first place we can start about understanding some things about death is to learn a little bit about death. And so a lot of times the way we can ease into this kind of delicate topic is let's talk about some science. Now recently, a child's 78,000-year-old grave marks Africa's oldest known human burial. Let's check it out. Excavations at Panga Yasedi pushed back the ritual's date at least a few thousand years. This is about this child who was buried over 78,000 years ago, and it marks Africa's oldest known human burial. A child whose lifeless body was carefully placed in an East African cave around 78,300 years ago has made a grand return. Researchers who unearthed the ancient youngster's remains say that they found the oldest known intentional human burial in Africa. The investigators who report the discovery in May 6th of Nature have named the ancient youngster Matoto. a Swahili word that means child. Mtoto was buried in a sheltered part of a cave that was repeatedly occupied by people over a span of nearly 80,000 years, up to about 500 years ago, said archaeologist Michael Petraglia of the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Jena, Germany, at a May 3rd news conference. Local people still visit this spot to worship and conduct rituals. Mtoto's discovery suggests that a quote-unquote tradition of symbolically significant burials, at least for the very young, might have been culturally embedded in parts of Africa. End quote. Toward the end of the Middle Stone Age, which ran from about 320,000 to 30,000 years ago, writes a bioarchaeologist, Louise Humphrey of the Natural History Museum in London in a comment published with the new paper. Excavations at Pangayasadi, or PYS, a cave site located in forested hills about 15 kilometers from Kenya's coast, revealed Mtoto's grave. Petraglia and Max Planck archaeologist Nicole Boivin led work there starting in 2010. Preliminary signs of Mtoto's burial appeared in 2013. Digging revealed part of a shallow pit, but fragmentary bones visible in the pit were too fragile to remove or study closely. Stone tools typically of Africa's Middle Stone Age had turned up in the same sediment, giving researchers a sense of how old the bones were. Lab analysis indicated that the sediment had last been exposed to sunlight about 78,300 years ago. Investigators excavated the entire pit in 2017 and covered it in a plaster for transport to the National Museums of Kenya in Nairobi. There, researchers noticed that 2 teeth in the pit looked human. The plastered pit was then sent to the paleoanthropologist Maria Martinen Torres at the National Research Center on Human Evolution in Burgos, Spain. After removing plaster around the earthen block, her team used CT imaging to create digital versions of the PYS bones, revealing a Homo sapiens child's partial skeleton. Fossil positions indicated that the child had been placed on his or her right side, with knees bent up toward the chest. Many bones were intact enough to be removed from the pit. The size and development of the 2 teeth in the pit indicated that the child had died at age 2.5 to 3 years old. Microscopic study of the fossils and chemical analysis of the pit sediment indicated that the child's body was interred soon after death, before decomposition began. That explains why parts of the child's skeleton remained well preserved, including a skull base connected to 3 neck bones. Special care was taken in burying Mtoto, Martin and Torres said. For instance, the skull base and attached neck bones had collapsed away from the other back bones in a way suggesting that the child's head originally laid on a support, or a pillow that had decayed. Rotation of the collarbone and 2 ribs suggested that Mtoto's upper body had originally been wrapped in a shroud. An infant found in a pit inside southern Africa's border cave in 1941 has previously been cited as Africa's earliest burial. But evidence for that argument remains uncertain, Petraglia says. The border cave infant dates to between 74,000 and 58,000 years ago. Even if it's true Mtoto is the oldest burial in Africa, more Middle Stone Age burials have been found in Eurasia and the Middle East than in Africa. Humans were buried in an Israeli cave more than 90,000 years ago, and Neanderthals may have buried their dead in an Iraqi Kurdistan cave 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. Mtoto and the possible border cave burial fit a Middle Stone Age pattern in Eurasia of regularly interring infants and children in public spots, says archaeologist Wau Zalau of the University of Barcelona, who was not involved in the study. After around 30,000 years ago, Eurasian infants and children were buried in remote locations, unlike teens and adults, he says. It's not clear why age-related differences in the treatment of the dead occurred at that time. Many Middle Stone Age Africans may have buried the dead of all ages away from living areas, not in caves where people continued to live, says archaeologist Lynn Wadley of the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, who also was not involved in this study. If that's the case, finding more African burials from Mtoto's time will most likely be a challenge. Quote-unquote, open-air burials are not easy to find, and preservation is likely to be poor, she says. So the reason I wanted to read this to you is to simply give you an idea, if you already didn't know, how old the art or the rite of burial is. So this Homo sapien, this child, is gently laid to rest, wrapped in linen on a pillow that's decomposed. Care is shown in the burial, so reverence is a thing over 78,000 years ago. As Freemasons, we have rites, and we have a rite of burial too, and we'll get there. But let's look a little deeper into death and the ritual that surrounds it. Now, according to the Pew Research Center and a few other national survey sites, they have stated that fewer and fewer people attend some sort of religious ceremony or a church. So this is a growing secularism amongst the population of the world. Now, secularism sounds like it would be a type of religion, but in actuality, secularism refers to the idea of being not religious. In fact, Freemasonry, in its move to be more open to many different faiths and ideologies, became more secular. So it became more open and inclusive, or not so dogmatic to any particular faith, such as Christianity, which it still is in many countries in the world. Freemasonry is Christian only. So one article that I found asked a question, and it was, what does dying and mourning look like in a secular age? 29% of Americans anticipate a secular funeral. So something that has no religious overtone at all. But what about this article? So Tara Isabella Burton published this back in 2018, December 4th, for Vox.com. Now, Vox is it's Latin for a voice, right? So here we go. What does dying and mourning look like in a secular age? When somebody dies in the Catholic tradition, people generally know what to do. There's the saying of the last rites at the dying person's bedside, the vigil for the deceased, also known as a wake, and often a formal mass of Christian burial. In the Jewish tradition, there's the practice of sitting Shiva, the week-long mourning process during which the family of the deceased remains at home and friends and relatives call on them to pay their respects. In the Islamic tradition, the deceased's body is ritually bathed and shrouded in white cloth before Muslims of the community gather to perform the Salat al-Janazah, the customary prayer for the dead. But what happens when you die and you don't follow any faith tradition? When Iris Explosion, an entertainer and social worker who prefers to go by her stage name, was widowed unexpectedly at the age of 28, she and her friends had to create the memorial service for her husband, John, from scratch. Explosion and her husband were not conventionally religious. She describes herself as a lax Jew, while her husband, a queer man interested in alchemy and other occult practices, often felt alienated from the born-again Christianity of his parents. The memorial service her friends created a few days after his death, she says, contained a blend of traditions and practices individual to John. A Jewish friend recited the mourner's Kaddish. The group told stories, some reverential, some bawdy, that reflected all aspects of John's personality. They played an orchestral rendition of the theme song to Legend of Zelda, John's favorite video game. Friends from out of town dialed in on Skype to share their stories. Numerous friends gave Explosion rose quartz, a stone associated in some New Age and occult traditions with heart healing, as a gift. The memorial service, as well as a second funeral service which took place a few months later, and was similarly eclectic in style, focused on John's personality and interests rather than being constrained by a specific set of traditions. Explosion is just one person among the 24% of Americans who identify as religiously unaffiliated. For the religious nuns, the issue of what happens when you die is an open question in more ways than one. According to a 2008 American Religious Identification Survey, the most recent year for which data is available, 29% of Americans do not anticipate having a religious funeral, for whatever reason. And given the steady increase in religious nuns over the past decade, that number will likely only rise. But what do secular funerals, or death rituals more broadly, look like? What can they provide that religious death rituals cannot? What are the challenges involved in putting them together? And as a secular funeral becomes increasingly individualistic, tailored to the preferences and needs of the deceased rather than a given religious or spiritual tradition, what does that mean for the sense of community engendered by ritual. Secular funerals are part of a wider unbundling of religion. It started with weddings. Scholar and psychologist Philip Zuckerman, author of Living the Secular Life, suggested in a telephone interview that secular funerals are just the latest iteration of the secularization of major life stages overall. Its genesis, he said, lies in the proliferation of secular weddings in America. In 2017, just 22% of American weddings took place in a house of worship, a nearly 20-point drop from 2009, according to the data from the weddings website, The Knot. Quote, "The first thing we saw was zillions of people going online and registering with the Universal Life Church," said Zuckerman, referring to an organization that virtually automatically ordains people over the internet so they can perform their own weddings for their friends and family, so they can still make it sacred but not under the auspices of religion. End quote. Different states have different laws about the extent to which the Universal Life ordinations are legally valid for performing weddings. Funerals, however, have no such restrictions. Zuckerman posits that among the people he's interviewed for his book research, the desire to have a secular funeral isn't just about not wanting to affirm the existence of a God or an afterlife that the deceased may or may not believe in. Rather, he says, it's about wanting to preserve a sense of the deceased's individuality. They just don't want fairy tales. They don't want to be told so-and-so is in a better place now or so-and-so is now with Jesus. They can find that talk annoying, Zuckerman said. We want to create our own Facebook page. Why wouldn't we want to create or curate our own funeral? More and more, Zuckerman said, he sees people choosing their own music and their own speeches that they want to be read after they die. I think that is part of our growing individual and less of this care of tradition. More and more people want to feel the idiosyncrasies of the dead person and the specialness of the dead person. This attitude, he says, is particularly prevalent in the United States. We all like to think in the United States that we're special. Why wouldn't we want our funerals to be special too? Certainly for Iris Explosion, commemorating on John's life in a way that felt true to his personality and character was a priority. From sharing John's favorite Spotify playlists with his friends to curate the music selection for the services to working in references to My Little Pony, a show John loved. Explosion and the couple's friends created a memorial for John that fit his character. So the article goes on, and it talks about the difficulties that secular rituals present with their own sets of challenges. For instance, it says that one of the most difficult parts of creating a secular death ritual is compensating for the lack of built-in community or built-in structure that often accompanies more established religious traditions. Zuckerman was quoted as saying, "One of the biggest problems for secular culture is that you have to cobble together and make it yourself. If you want your kid to have a bar mitzvah, it's all taken care of. You want your kid to go through confirmation class at the Episcopal Church? Boom, they're enrolled. If you want to do a secular version of that, good luck. You're on your own. You have to figure it out. Explain it to people, rent the space, find the people, figure out how to write up your own program. It's a lot of effort." This secular outlook for funeral rites really has 2 points, which is to make sense of a beloved's death, and second, and this is just as important, that when you do this, you don't do it alone. So you need a sense of community. So we've established that people were getting buried 80,000 years ago in a very specific and reverential way. We've talked about the difficulties of what it looks like when somebody dies and they have no religious tradition at all. But now, what happens when we look at some other cultures' death rituals? From newscientist.com, they have an article that I found called 5 Death Rituals to Give You a New View on Funerals. Let's check this out and get another set of interesting perspectives. Every culture has a different death ritual, some involving levels of intimacy that would be unthinkable to people in the West. And here are just 5 of them, published on newscientist.com by Julia Brown back in 2017. She writes, "Every culture deals with death in its own way. Caitlin Doughty, a mortician and founder of the Order of the Good Death, says Westerners are estranged from and overly fearful of death, and thinks that it's partly because our funerary rituals distance us physically from the bodies of our loved ones. She thinks we should get more involved with the process, and not only that, but there are also many more options than we think. She has traveled the world to find the good death. Here are some death rituals that might put Western practices into perspective. A journey for the body, Indonesia. In the highlands of South Sulawesi in Indonesia live the Torijans, who are renowned for their elaborate funerals. These people believe that death is not a sudden process but more a gradual journey. The body stays with the family after what others would call death, but what Torijans see as a form of sickness, and they continue to care for and talk to their loved one. The funeral is huge and can take place weeks or months later to allow the family to raise the necessary funds and gather everyone together. Only after the funeral is the person's soul thought to move on to the afterlife. The mummified body is then placed in a stone grave or cave, or their coffin is hung from a cliff. Every few years, in a ritual called Manen, held in August, they are exhumed, cleaned, and redressed. Chopsticks and DNA, Japan. Family members use chopsticks to pick up the bones of their loved ones after cremation and place them in an urn. The foot bones go in first and the head last. This is one of several stages following a wake around the open casket, the giving of a Buddhist name to the deceased, and a funeral. The Japanese have family graves with space for several urns. The funeral industry is big business in Japan, and a variety of services are now offered, including having your loved one's DNA extracted and incorporated into a keepsake, such as a necklace. Funeral pyres, Crestone, Colorado. Crestone is a small town in Colorado and the location of the only outdoor cremation site in the United States. People can be cremated there regardless of religion, with the body typically wrapped in a cloth and surrounded by wood and branches of juniper. If they wish, family members may set the torch themselves. The practice is part of a growing natural death movement in the United States that includes green burials and home funerals, and is partly a response to the country's rising funeral costs. Fantasy coffins in Ghana. People in the Accra region create elaborate coffins that are also considered works of art. These originated with the Ga people, who believe that life carries on in another place after death in the same way it did before. So the coffins are made to represent something that person loved, or that symbolizes their life, such as a fish or a chili pepper, and to show the person's importance to others. The funeral itself is a big, day-long celebratory gathering. Sky burial in Tibet. Buddhists in Tibet believe in the transmigration of the soul, and therefore that once the person has died, the body is an empty vessel. In sky burials, the body is cut into pieces and placed in an exposed place where animals, such as vultures, can consume it. This is considered an act of generosity, allowing the living to benefit from the body once it is no longer needed. It is also practical, given that the cold, rocky grounds make burial difficult, and there is a scarcity of trees to provide wood for burning. So out of all of these 5 wild ones, which ones have you heard of before? I know that I have seen the images before where in Indonesia the family members are removed and cleaned and redressed, and even people taking pictures with their loved ones. So that was no surprise to me. I have a close friend of mine who recently lost their father in Japan, and they performed this ritual of putting the bones into the urn. So that was not so wild to me either. Now, the funeral pyres in Crestone, Colorado, I'm kind of like, sign me up. This sounds really interesting and kind of awesome, in my opinion. Then the fantasy coffins in Ghana, which I had not seen before or heard of, but I had heard of the sky burial in Tibet. Now, in the article it says that the bodies are cut up. Now, I haven't heard that. I've heard that the bodies are tied up, not cut up, but perhaps they are. So now we've taken a look at this natural progression of how long we've looked at death. It's been around, the process for burial, what we do when we don't have an option for a religious type of burial, and some worldly different customs when it comes to death rituals. Now, death rituals are largely for the living to make sense of and get closure over the loss of some person, but also If the belief is that it is needed for that person after death, then it serves that purpose as well. Now this leads us into the realm here of the Masonic funeral. Now if you've never been to a Masonic funeral, it is very interesting. Now it definitely has a Christian flavor to it, and you know it's Masonic. In fact, it's this Masonic funeral that brought Chris Hodap, author of Freemasons for Dummies, into Freemasonry itself. You can hear that story in episode 100 of this podcast. Now, Masonic funerals are defined in the Wikipedia as the following. In some Masonic jurisdictions, a Masonic funeral is a rite afforded to Master Masons in good standing with their lodges. Under extenuating circumstances, satisfactory to the master of their lodges, Masonic funerals may also be conducted in memory of fellowcrafts or entered apprentices who received their degree less than 1 year prior to their death, or to a Master Mason who had been suspended for non-payment of dues within the same time limit. The Masonic funeral rites are performed by a deceased Master Mason's lodge, so that he can be honored by those who have known him and his works. It is one of the few ceremonies performed in public by Freemasons. Such a Masonic funeral is carried out at the request of a Master Mason or his family. Now, some issues I would take, I think, with this definition is that in my own home jurisdiction, once a Mason, you are an entered apprentice. You are a Mason then. So in Illinois, anyway, you only must be an entered apprentice to qualify for a Masonic funeral. It doesn't matter the length of time either. If you left the fraternity for non-payment of dues, then I have seen a few occasions where they were not afforded the Masonic funeral, but also they weren't asked to do it either. Now, it does have a section here on notable Masonic funerals. George Washington's funeral was organized by the local Masonic Lodge and held on December 18, 1799, following a celebration of the Episcopal Order of Burial. A Masonic funeral took place, conducted by the Reverends James Muir of Alexandria Presbyterian Church and Dr. Elijah Dick. On the 29th of July, 2020, a Masonic funeral ceremony for Congressman John R. Lewis took place in the Georgia State Capitol. Lewis was a senior Freemason in the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge, F&AM of Georgia, and in the Scottish Rite Southern jurisdiction. This was really interesting. I knew about John R. Lewis, and I knew about George Washington. This is just interesting that Freemasonry has its own rite, its own death rite. Now, usually these rites, when we think about them, are performed by the master of ceremonies in whatever religious practice you have. Now, Freemasonry claims to not be a religion, which we are not, and yet we have a ceremony. Let's think about that for just a moment. Because it is a public ceremony, let me read you just a few quips from the Masonic service here in this public ceremony. We mourn today the loss of a brother whose spirit has been summoned to the land where our fathers have gone before us. Again, we behold the narrow house appointed for all the living, and our thoughts turn to that silent realm where, in that peace which the world can neither give nor take away, lie the unnumbered dead. The sunshine and the storm pass over them, and they are not disturbed. Stones and lettered monuments symbolize the love of surviving friends and convey the silent admonition, seek, yea, the narrow path, and the strait gate that led unto eternal life. Again we are called upon to consider the uncertainty of human life, the absolute certainty of death, and the vanity of earthly ambition. Change and decay are written upon every living thing. The cradle and the coffin stand side by side, and it is a melancholy truth that as soon as we begin to live, that moment also we begin to die. The messenger of death comes when least expected, and at a moment which to us seems the meridian of our existence. If you've ever been to a Masonic funeral, there is then a point at where we bestow the white apron back to our brother. We also sometimes will put an evergreen sprig on or in the right hand or on the body, and that evergreen sprig really has that same meaning it has always had, one of rebirth, like an acacia, a plant that comes back year after year. It is a symbol of immortality of the soul. A bit more from the public ceremony. Soft and safe be thy earthly bed of our brother, bright and glorious be his rising from it, fragrant be the acacia sprig which shall flourish there. May the earliest buds of spring unfold their beauties over his resting place, and in the bright morning of the world's resurrection may his soul spring into newness of life and expand into immortal beauty in realms beyond the skies. Until then, dear friend and brother, until then, farewell. It's then followed up with a reverential prayer, which is as secular as you might find in a Masonic ceremony. Most Freemasons that I know, and in many jurisdictions, a qualification for membership, or a stipulation rather, is that there may be an expectation that you have a belief in the eternal soul, a life that comes next. This has also been a contingent point in some jurisdictions where people have openly said they don't have this belief and had been brought under Masonic charges to leave the fraternity. I think that's a shame. I hope cooler heads prevailed in those instances, but it is interesting. We are a secular organization, so one wonders why the stipulation there. Certainly, Freemasonry teaches all manner of amazing things through its tenets and cardinal virtues and the charges on all three of the degrees and the sublime degree of a Master Mason. So let's round out this section on death. And let me ask you 2 questions for our Craftsman Plus. Number 1, has Freemasonry truly prepared you? Do you feel prepared to pay the final debt? Yes or no, and why? What are your fears? What do you look forward to? Second question, a bit more of a scholarly question and a little less reflective. As I mentioned earlier, why does Freemasonry have its own ritual service if we're not a religion at all? I look forward to reading your answers in the Facebook group. Now, I know some people might be thinking that this episode was really dark, and I really don't want you to take it as a dark episode. I would love you to take it as an exploratory episode, to get comfortable with this idea, because through this work of contemplation, knowing, thinking, we might be more at peace when our time comes, whenever that might be. I wish you all peace of mind and to live every day as close as in the moment as you can. That's it for this week. Until next week, stay on the level. For Whence Came You, I'm Robert Johnson. Take care.
You've been listening to Whence Came You, a Masonic podcast featuring research papers and discussions related to Freemasonry with your host, Brother Robert Johnson. Be sure to join us for our next edition.